Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Today we're going to read at least a couple of chapters at a time. So, starting with Chapter 5. She is surprised. There's a gun to your head and death in his eyes. That night, Izuku practiced his knife skills as much as he could without a partner or a knife. He didn't have a knife, but the plastic spoon he had found in the street on his walk home was going to have to do for now. He hoped to find one at Dagobah Beach, but he hadn't had much luck yet. Every once in a while, he'd scribble down a new question he'd ideally ask a self-defense teacher in his notebook, but they'd have to wait. His cell service had been cut off several weeks ago, and his phone wasn't much use for anything besides emergency calls when it wasn't connected to Wi-Fi. He'd ask the all-knowing internet sensei his questions next time he was at the library. Izuku was starting to think finding that flashlight was a fluke. Maybe it was fate's piss-poor way of trying to apologize for Izuku's generally crap luck, because he'd spent the last 2 pre-shower evenings sifting through refuse, and he'd yet to find anything really useful to him. The best thing so far was an only slightly rusted screwdriver, which was only potentially useful as he didn't currently have anything to use it on. He was about to give up when he finally spotted it. A kitchen knife. That would work. It was comically large and a little unwieldy, and also slightly bent. But ideally, he wouldn't even have to use it, so its size worked to his advantage. Holding it in his small hand made it look even bigger. Hopefully, the sight of someone wielding that would be enough of a deterrent for anyone looking to mess with him. He'd spent the last week, including a full weekend at the library, researching knife fighting techniques, as well as Muay Thai and Judo. Each night, he'd go through drills on his own with his kitchen knife in the warehouse. Izuku had always soaked up information like a sponge, so theoretically, he knew a lot about fighting. Theoretically, he knew how to disarm and take down a larger opponent, but Izuku wasn't stupid. He knew theory and practice are 2 very different things. He was acting like he was going to go get into fights. He's being paranoid again. He's not going to get any more prepared in a void. He knew the theory. Practice was the next step anyway. Izuku suited up and set out. The nights were starting to get chilly, and he was glad for the hoodie he opted to wear. As he'd expected, he heard no one around his warehouse. There were holes in the walls. If people were out there making noise, he would have heard it from inside. He had heard some skittering and scuttling, so he was hoping to see what types of critters were causing that noise. He'd checked the alley a few times, but figured whatever it was must have been nocturnal because he'd never seen it. His first task of the night. He felt silly getting excited like this, but he was 12. He was allowed to act like it sometimes. Creeping around the corner as quietly as he could, he prepared to sit down and wait for the critter to show itself, when a loud metallic bang had him letting out an undignified yelp and falling back on his ass. Searching for the source of the sound as he scrambled backward, he saw 2 big golden eyes staring back at him from on top of the dumpster. The cat hissed and swatted at the air in front of it threateningly. Izuku urged his racing heart to slow. It was just a cat, albeit it wasn't a very nice cat, but it was just a cat. He raised his hands placatingly as he slowly stood up and backed away. Once he was far enough away that the cat didn't consider him an immediate threat, it stopped hissing and just glared at him. Finally able to get a good look at it, he realized this cat was huge. Not like fat huge, it was just really big. It looked to be at least 1.5 feet tall. He couldn't tell what color it was in the dark, and he wasn't about to shine the light on it to satiate his curiosity. He could, however, see that it was very fluffy, and he very much wanted to pet it. Backing around the corner and out of sight, he vowed to pet that cat. It might not like him now, but they were neighbors. He should be on good terms with his neighbors. He used to spend some of his food money on cat treats. That's how he won the hearts of strays uptown. It may not be the most responsible way to spend his money, but a cat that big had to be working itself to death hunting enough rats to eat out here in the warehouse district. Surely treats would win them over. The rest of the warehouse district had very little to offer. Someone was definitely up to something in the warehouse on Block 8. He was glad he trusted his gut with that. He didn't get too close, but he could hear two people having what sounded like a drunken argument out back, and he saw lights on through several windows. Satisfied with the information he gathered on his immediate surroundings, he started his way back to Block 15. It was early September, and the cool air had started to nip at his nose. He should get a mask if he was going to be gallivanting around like this again. He made a mental note to stop at the mini-mart after school for a face mask and cat treats as he curled into his blanket. The next night found Izuku creeping around in the alley behind his warehouse again, this time with treats in hand. He was only slightly more prepared for the resounding bang as the cat jumped down from its perch onto the dumpster. He managed to only let out a little eep, but he did end up on his ass again when he tripped over a pipe half eroded out of the ground. "Well, good evening to you too, Miss Dumpster Jump Scare," he grumbled as he stood up and brushed himself off. In all honesty, he was a little embarrassed and mad that a cat had knocked him on his ass twice with the same trick. She only hissed in response. "You know, friendship goes two ways. You should be nicer to your neighbors," he retorted with a bit of a scowl. She glared back. "I have brought a peace offering," he said as he fished a couple of treats from his pocket and tossed them at the foot of the dumpster. She glanced down at the treats, seemingly uninterested, and continued staring daggers into Izuku's soul. "This isn't going to be as easy as I'd hoped it would be, is it?" he asked the cat, who again gave no reaction. With a sigh, he turned away. His plan to dip his toes into uptown past the warehouse district tonight. There was likely far more intel to be gathered there. He was fairly certain that the Block 8 warehouse had become headquarters for the local gang, but besides that, the district was pretty barren. This place was severely under-policed. It was practically a breeding ground for criminal organizations. He'd have to keep a watchful eye out. If a small-time gang can set up base there, then who else could? Uptown was a more residential area. It's where he would usually walk in the daytime, so he knew the streets like the back of his hand. However, he had no data on the nightlife. That was something he was going to change tonight. The nightlife was much like he'd expected it to be on a Wednesday. The bars were open and were housing a few drunks, and there were some homeless people sleeping in alleys. He felt bad keeping his hidey hole a secret from them, but it was quite literally all he had. They seemed to at least have some sort of community here. All he had was a cat that hated him. It smelled strongly of weed, but it smelled like that in the daytime too, so that was hardly new information. At one point, Izuku definitely saw someone buying drugs in an alley, but he decided that was very much not his business and continued creeping his way through the shadows. He saw several scantily clad figures smoking on the corner outside a bar, creatively labeled izakaya. He may be 12, but didn't spend the last few years wandering around the slums to not know what they were loitering around the bar for, dressed like that. So far, he hadn't seen anyone he recognized. Or maybe he just couldn't tell in the low light. The further away from the bars he got, the less populated the streets became. Looking down each alley he passed, yielded nothing of interest, so he figured he'd start heading home. He was about to do just that when he heard a muffled cry coming from the alley across the street. He really shouldn't check that out. But what if it was someone in trouble? Clearly someone was in trouble. And if he went over there, there would just be two people in trouble. He could stay hidden. He was good at that. He could just go over there and see if he could help, right? If he could help, he'd help. If he couldn't, he'd be on his way. His feet seemed to have decided that was a good course of action, and despite all logic telling him otherwise, he made his way to the entrance of the alley. It was dark, but it seemed that a large figure had a much smaller figure pinned to a wall. The muffled cries sounded like a woman. Oh, Kami, he couldn't just walk away from this. He needed to do something, and he needed to do it fast. He crept further into the alley. Hiding himself was a man who looked to have a rhinoceros mutation quirk, and he was big, very big, like All Might big. This wasn't a fight he could win by strength, that's for sure. He needed to fight smart and use his surroundings. He had to think. Come on, think. What do you know? What's a weak point? If the man's quirk adhered to a rhino's capabilities, then the man should have pretty poor eyesight. Rhinos have terrible eyesight. That's what makes them so deadly. They charge at anything that moves. Kami, this was a terrible idea. He was going to get himself killed. Send out a final, "It is what it is," to the universe. He threw a can up and over to the other side of the two figures. When they whipped their heads in the direction of the noise, he stepped out from his hiding spot, keeping low to the ground. This was the moment of truth, when both of them looked in the other direction, where Izuku actually was. The woman's eyes caught his immediately, but the rhino man's eyes passed over him several times, searching for movement before seeming satisfied by the stillness. Once the man returned his attention to his previous task, Izuku locked eyes with the woman again. Slowly standing up, he pointed to the woman and mimed kneeing someone in the crotch, and then stuck his thumb over his shoulder. Hoping she got the message to hit the man and run, he held out 3 fingers, keeping them in her line of sight as he snuck into a position that left a path for her to run, but stuck himself between her and the man once she got away. Bracing himself, he put down 1 finger, then the next, then the last. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" he bellowed in the deepest voice he could muster without risking his voice breaking. Simultaneously, he shined his flashlight in the man's eyes, and, thank the gods, the woman took the distraction to knee him in the jewels. The combination of stimuli set him off balance enough for the woman to push her way out and book it. The second she passed Izuku, he turned to follow, but a very distinct clicking noise had him stopping in his tracks. "Who the frick do you think you are, Pipsqueak?" Slowly turning around showed him exactly what he feared it might be. He was staring down the barrel of a gun. He froze. "I asked you a question," he said, shaking the gun in Izuku's face as if he didn't see it or needed a reminder. I, he sputtered out pathetically. "Oh, you're not so big and tough now, are you?" he taunted. The woman was gone. He took solace in that. He saved her. He actually saved her. That would have been enough for him. He stood his ground and accepted his fate. That would have to be enough for him. He stood his ground and accepted his fate. It felt like he'd been standing there forever. He knew the man was talking or shouting at him, but it was all just static. He seemed to be getting angrier with Izuku's lack of response, but he couldn't force himself to do anything about it. Hey! A shrill voice from the mouth of the alley cut through the fog in his mind. She was back. Before he even knew what was happening, he batted the man's hand to the side, and a shot rang out. But Izuku didn't stop. He lunged towards the wall and used it as a springboard to leap back at the man, who was once again regaining his wits. With all the weight he could put behind it, he slammed his flashlight down into where he hoped the man's pressure point was. Distantly, he heard a "Run, you dumbass!" shouted from the direction of rapidly receding footsteps, but all his attention was taken up by the man falling to the ground like a sack of potatoes. He just did that. He just knocked out a man easily thrice his size. He just knocked out a man thrice his size who had a gun. A gun that was now laying on the ground of the grimy alley next to the man he just knocked out. Gingerly, Izuku picked up the gun to get it out of the man's reach should he suddenly rouse. His vision was starting to go a bit fuzzy around the edges, and he couldn't seem to catch his breath as he shakily backed away from the scene. The crime scene. The crime scene that he was a part of. His mind was reeling, reaching out and trying to grasp onto something. Anything. Someone had told him to do something. He was supposed to do something right now. All at once, his mind grasped onto the command, "Run, you dumbass!" And run he did. Turning on his heel, he sprinted out of the alley in no particular direction. He just needed to get away. Far away, and quickly. He ran until he could taste blood. He was somewhere in the warehouse district, but he was far too panicked to tell where. He didn't even fully remember how he got here, much less where here was. He collapsed in on himself against the nearest wall. He's not entirely sure if he passed out or not, but when he came back to his senses, he was exhausted. He was exhausted, and he had a gun, and he didn't know where he was. If he wasn't too tired to have another panic attack, he probably would have. He had a gun. He was very much not supposed to have a gun. A gun covered in his fingerprints. Shit. Alright, so he had a gun now. He needed to get back home and sleep off this fever dream. Author's Note, Chapter 5. The cat doesn't make it, don't get attached. Chapter 6. I get knocked down, then get knocked down again. Izuku's not sure how or when he made it back to the warehouse, but apparently he did as he was now bundled in his blankets and being woken up by his alarm. He would be inclined to think that last night was an especially vivid fever dream if it weren't for the fact that A, he wasn't feverish, and B, when he turned on his flashlight, he could clearly see a gun lying on the ground on the far side of the landing. Sitting up, he found a third reason to believe last night wasn't a fever dream when he felt a twinge of pain in his arm. Point C. He had a thinly scabbed over gash on his left shoulder, and blood was crusted into his hoodie sleeve. When the hell did that happen? The man never got a hit on him. Did he get it while he was running in a dissociative haze? With dawning horror, Izuku realized that he had batted the man's hand to the left before a shot rang out. Was he grazed by the bullet without even noticing? If he'd hit the man's hand with just a little less force, that bullet could have gone through his heart. Among the things one could do immediately upon waking up, realizing you had a bullet wound would not be on the top of Izuku's list of recommendations. He felt himself starting to slip into another panic attack. He was shot. He would have been shot in the head if that woman hadn't come back for him. He could have been shot in the heart if he moved a fraction of a second slower. That situation could have ended with him or the woman dead in a million different ways, and all of them were flitting through his mind at light speed. What if the man's eyesight was perfectly fine, and he just shot Izuku where he stood before he could get that woman the chance to escape? What if the woman hadn't come back? What if the man didn't hesitate to shoot him while he was running away? What if he had gotten caught? That guy was huge. He could have just stepped on him a few times and left him for dead. What if... He had to stop before he couldn't think enough to even think of calming down. He pressed his palms down onto the slightly chilled concrete and did his best to force his breathing to regulate. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Over and over he repeated it like a mantra in his head. Yes, those things could have happened, but they didn't. He was here, and he was as safe as he could be. That woman was safe too, and wasn't that a nice thought? She was safe because of Izuku. Granted, he was also safe because of her, so it's not like he could say it was some sort of heroic act, but he stopped something bad from happening. The world was a better place than it would have been if not for him. That's something he would tell himself on his worst days. He would think of the cats he fed, or the people, so accustomed to being ignored, who he smiled and waved at. He would think of how those cats would be hungrier, or those people would be lonelier, if not for him, and that would have to be enough for him to keep going some days. After a few minutes, he had a better handle on his thoughts. He was still rattled, but he was coherent. Little victories. All right, time to address the issue at hand. How the hell was he supposed to treat a bullet wound? It wasn't deep, but it was gnarly. Thankfully, it was no longer bleeding. The blood on the sleeve was still tacky in some places, and it had gotten on his blanket as well. It wasn't an insubstantial amount of blood, but he didn't feel faint, so it couldn't be too bad, right? Calling it a bullet wound wasn't helping. For all intents and purposes, it was a scratch. A rather bad scratch that just so happened to be from a bullet, but a scratch nonetheless. Izuku knew how to treat a scratch. Kacchan's friend with the ratty nails quirk had given him plenty of practice over the years. Step 1, clean it. Was it too late for that? Should he risk disturbing the scab? It had been sitting for hours at this point. But he'd been sitting on the dirty floor of an abandoned building with an open wound for hours at this point. Yeah, he should probably clean it. At the very least, it wouldn't hurt to try. Well, that wasn't true. It would hurt very much to try, but that's beside the point. Gingerly, Izuku pulled off his sweatshirt and rolled up the sleeve of his t-shirt. He was thankful he had a first aid kit with all the bells and whistles. He would have preferred that his life up to this point hadn't necessitated it, but, well, beggars can't be choosers. Pulling out a pack of gauze and some rubbing alcohol, he braced himself for the familiar sting as he gently blotted the wound and surrounding area. Step 2. Dress it. After inspecting the site thoroughly and deeming it free of any lingering blanket or hoodie fuzzies, he used a cotton swab to spread antibiotic cream on the now sluggishly bleeding wound. Looking through the kit, there didn't seem to be a bandage big enough to cover the scratch, but he really needed to keep it clean. He decided the best course of action was to Frankenstein 2 of the jumbo band-aids. He wiped down the scissors that came with the kit and cut the sticky side off one end and placed it over the first half of the wound. Then he completed the seal by overlapping the fully intact bandage over the first bandage and the latter half of the wound. Once he'd made sure that the edges had a good seal around the wound, he gathered all the bloodied fabric and shoved it in the duffel bag with the rest of his dirty laundry. He'd have to bump up laundry day. Out of tasks, his mind started to wander. He saved that woman. He took out a man thrice his size and saved someone. Izuku knew in the depths of his mind he had given up on his dreams of becoming a hero years ago. He'd just been lying to himself. What was that saying? Putting a band-aid over a bullet wound? Huh. Yeah. He was drowning and dreaming up something to grab onto, but he knew it wasn't real. It could never save him. It just delayed the inevitable. That dream was a lifeline, but deep down Izuku knew that hope was a dangerous thing. Like a faulty harness. It would lift you up only to give you further to fall when it broke. Not if, when. Izuku spent his whole life falling for that trick over and over. But he'd saved that woman, and the warmth that sparked in his chest terrified him. He couldn't let himself fall again. He knew he wouldn't be able to get back up this time. He shook his head to dispel the thought from his mind and checked the time. It was already past 6:30. He wouldn't have time to go to the library today. Maybe he could find a laundromat with Wi-Fi or find a way to bypass the school's password protection during lunch. He needed to look up how to better care for the Greys. He still felt a bit floaty, and he was like 80% sure it wasn't because of blood loss. It's just something that happened on bad days. He supposed getting shot was a good enough reason to have a bad day, so he just let himself float. He'd been doing that a lot lately. With a sigh, Izuku got dressed in his school uniform and prepared for another day in paradise. Deku was acting fucking weird. More than his standard level of weird. He'd always been spacey. He'd sit down with his stalker notes and mumble to himself for hours if no one stopped him, but now it seemed like he was hardly ever present. He'd been steadily becoming less of a crybaby, but for the past couple months, he hadn't reacted to a dang thing. The extras would shout their stale insults, and he wouldn't give so much as a frown. He wasn't worried about the loser, though. Definitely not. He was pissed. That sucker was walking around like a robot. It was creepy, and Katsuki was sick of it. There were other changes over the last few months, too. Every couple of days, he'd come to school or to class looking like a wet dog. And he'd started getting lunch from the cafeteria, which he never did before. Katsuki didn't know why he bothered when it ended up on the floor half the time. Maybe his mommy stopped packing his lunch for him because he was a big boy now. He bet the dumbass couldn't figure out how to make his own lunch to save his life. His mom made him learn how to cook as soon as he could hold a pencil. The nerd wasn't going to get far in life if he kept relying on handouts like a baby. Every day he'd run out of the cafeteria like a dog with its tail between its legs, with whatever remained of his lunch, and today was no exception. Stupid, predictable Deku. Katsuki stood just outside the cafeteria doors and waited, and like clockwork, out came Deku, who turned around and spotted him immediately. His face kept that creepy-ass blank expression that he'd been sporting around. He slapped the tray out of his hands and onto the floor. Deku just looked at the ground, and then back up at Katsuki, expression stoic as ever. What the hell is your problem, Deku? He quirked his eyebrow slightly, as if he had no idea what Katsuki was talking about. Why are you walking around like a damn robot? You throwing a temper tantrum because Mommy stopped making lunch for you? He shot back. His eyebrow lowered back into place, and his face once again returned to that stupid, lifeless expression. My mother hasn't cooked for me for several years, Kacchan, he replied with that stupid frickin' stutter, ignoring Katsuki's question entirely and calling him by that cutesy nickname again. This sucker just lived to piss him off, didn't he? Grabbing him by the shirt, he slammed the smaller boy into a nearby wall. His only reaction was his eyes widening in surprise. Answer the question, Deku. What the hell is your problem? Seeing his face up close didn't make it any less creepy. Now, less than a foot away from Deku's dull eyes, just stared back at him. There were dark bags under them, and he didn't even look scared. Katsuki had him pinned, and he didn't even seem to give a care. Why do you care, Kacchan? He finally responded flatly. Was he too stupid to realize he was being threatened? Why wasn't he scared? Oh, he'd give him something to be scared about. With no preamble, he let go and punched Deku square in the face. Immediately, he went tumbling to the ground. Pathetic. Huh. Where's the tough guy act now, Deku? He sneered as he looked down at him. Katsuki searched his face to see his reaction. He looked scared. Good. But he wasn't looking at Katsuki. He didn't seem to be looking anywhere. He was just wearing a scared version of that creepy-ass face, staring unfocused at nothing. He kicked him in his stomach to get his attention, but he just let out a yelp and curled into a ball. He kicked him a few more times, but he didn't give any sort of reaction again. Whatever. Stop walking around looking like a robot, Deku. It's creepy, he spat as he turned on his heel and walked away. Izuku didn't know how long he'd spent curled up in a ball on the floor after Kacchan left him, before the janitor found him. It couldn't have been too long, or he would have been trampled by the students leaving the cafeteria at the end of lunch by now, but he wasn't. He was being gently nudged by the janitor's foot, and he thinks he might have been talking to him. Once his brain caught up to the situation, he scrambled to his feet and bowed in apology. I'm sorry, sir. I'll clean this up. I'm so sorry. The janitor narrowed his eyes and furrowed his brow. He nudged Izuku's shoulder to try to get him to stop bowing, and he couldn't help but flinch away and bite back a yelp as his injury was jostled. You okay, kid? He asked. The question shocked Izuku enough to look the man in the eye. His expression looked somewhere between concerned and annoyed. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. He managed to stammer in response. This isn't the first time this has happened, son. The man continued. Oh, yeah. Annoyed. He was definitely annoyed. Why did he think he was worried? Stupid Deku. I know, sir. I'm sorry, he said as he stepped back and looked at the ground, preparing himself for a scolding. Instead, the man asked, Do you want me to ask Anze-san to bring your lunch to you at the kitchen door? Again, Izuku was shocked enough to whip his head up. You don't have to do that, Izuku said, even though he very much wanted to say yes and possibly even kiss the ground this man walked on. This had to be a trick. It'd save us both the trouble of gesturing vaguely to the mess on the floor. That. Izuku searched the man's face for some sign that he was joking, but he even looked around as if a crowd was ready to pop out and laugh at him for thinking someone would care enough to do that for him. But the man just looked bored, and the halls were empty except for the two of them. Uh, um, I, yeah, yes, I would, I like that if you could do that. Thank you very much. He couldn't believe this was happening. There was no way this was happening. No problem, kid. Like I said, saving us both the effort. Why don't you get to class? Bell's gonna ring soon. But the mess. I got it, kid. It's literally my job. Now scram. He said in the same bored tone he'd had the whole time, like he wasn't shattering Izuku's worldview. He was going to argue more when the shrill tone of the bell cut through the air. Thank you, sir, he said as he dashed back to class before his peers caused another scene. The man just let out a non-committal hum and waved him off. Chapter 7. Shinso Family Trauma Hour. Hitoshi was going to talk to that kid today. He really was. He had told himself that every day for the last few weeks, but this time he really was, except he never showed up. For the first time in over 2 months, he didn't show up. Maybe the fates were trying to tell him something. He did his best to pretend he wasn't lonely. He let himself adopt a lone wolf persona a long time ago, and he wrapped the pelt around him like a shield. He could pretend all he wanted. He could shrug off his mother's concern, but that didn't change the reality of the situation. He was lonely. This year, his mother had decided enough was enough. She couldn't keep sending her child somewhere he wasn't safe and have him come back beaten and bruised both mentally and physically. So every day he found himself here, in the library, taking online classes while his mother worked. It's not like he had friends to miss. He should be happier he wasn't getting his crap rocked daily anymore, but it wasn't better. It was just a different kind of bad. He didn't miss his classmates' company, but he did miss listening in on their jokes. A good portion of his peers simply ignored him, and he could let his mind play into the illusion that they were his friends. Kami, he was a creep, and he was doing the same thing to that green-haired kid. He just thought that maybe this kid could be different. He showed up to the library at opening and did seemingly non-academic research of his own free will and shied away from anything that moved. That didn't really fit the profile of a bully, and Hitoshi had let himself start to hope. He waved goodbye the last time he saw him, and Greenie just nodded and scrambled out the door. He didn't even know his name. He'd just been calling him Greenie in his head, and he'd probably scared him away, and now he'd never know. Gah! He exclaimed to the empty library as he not so gently rested his head on the desk. His mother peeked out from around a bookshelf he didn't know she'd been restocking. You okay, Toshi? Startled, he whipped his head around and hastily replied, Yeah, I'm fine. You sure about that? Fine people don't normally bash their heads into tables, she countered. She raised an eyebrow at him when he ignored the snide comment by once again pressing his face into the desk. Is it about that little green boy? He was going to get whiplash because, again, his head shot up in surprise to face her. How the heck did she know that? He's not here today, and I know you've been psyching yourself up to talk to him. All he could do was sputter out vague denials that didn't really form a coherent sentence. You're not subtle, kiddo. I could feel how excited you get every time he walks in from the other side of the library, she said with a wry grin. Dang it, He really thought he was getting better at hiding things from her. Maybe he was. She hadn't asked him about the worsening depression. Excitement is usually something that pops up suddenly. Maybe he just kept projecting it for a moment before he had the chance to squash it down. Double dang it. That means she just felt all that surprise and dread. Ugh. He said nothing and put his head back on the desk, this time pillowed by his arms, as if blocking her from his periphery would make the problem go away. Kohaku was worried about the green kid. She'd never met anyone so young with such guarded emotions, and the only one she'd been able to parse out with any certainty was fear. Shinso Kohaku's quirk is called Emotional Field. This ability grants her access to a mental plane where everyone's emotions are projected unless they make a conscious effort not to. It didn't have a set range. The way she sensed things was like sound. The louder the sound, the farther away it can travel. The stronger the emotion, the further away she could feel it. This aspect of her quirk couldn't be turned off, only ignored. The second part, should she choose to use it, allowed her to reach out and manipulate the emotions she sensed. She didn't even know she could do that until she was in high school when one of her classmates was called to the principal's office and told that her mother had passed away in an incident on the other side of town. The girl's sorrow came out of nowhere and ripped through Kohaku's mind. It was debilitating, and she fell to the floor weeping in the middle of the classroom. She'd felt other people's grief before, but that time was too close, too fresh, and it came without any warning. She couldn't think of anything beyond, make it stop, please, Kami, make it stop. And it did. And in a room down the hall, the girl who just lost her mom stopped crying. She became unresponsive and just stared, catatonic, at the wall. It didn't take long for the teachers to connect the incidents, and it seemed to take even less time for the news to spread across the school. Before that day, if you asked anyone about Kohaku, they'd say she was the kindest person that you'd ever met. She was always so in tune with everyone. She was the shoulder to cry on. She was friends with everyone. After that day, if you asked about Kohaku, they'd say Kohaku could twist your mind and you wouldn't even know it. She's probably been doing it to us this whole time. She tricked us all into liking her. You can't trust her. She can just make you feel however she wants. It didn't matter to them that she didn't mean to. It didn't matter that she never manipulated anyone into liking her. Her reputation for kindness didn't matter. Her actions didn't matter. No one seemed to care about what she had done, only about what she could do. It wasn't until she was a full-grown adult that she'd managed to crawl her way out from under the oppressive weight of isolation. It took several years, but she'd finally managed to find enough open-minded people who saw her beyond what she could do that she didn't feel quite so alone. But Kohaku knew what loneliness felt like. It had clung to her like the persistent scent of cigarette smoke for years, and she could feel it surrounding her son like a storm cloud. She saw far too much of herself in that boy. She knew he was struggling, and she knew that he was trying to hide it from her. She didn't know what to do. Kids are cruel and easily frightened. If someone tells them something is scary, they'll believe it. And Kohaku knew that once people judged you for something, it was nigh impossible to make them change their minds. She gave up trying to change people's minds about her a long time ago. But looking at how people treated her son, she wanted to grab the world, shake it, and say, "Look at him. Actually, look at him. He's so kind. You've been putting him down for years and he's never hurt you. Just give him a chance." But she couldn't. And even if she could, it wouldn't make a difference. How do you tell a kid that the only way he's ever going to find people who treat him like a person is to break his own heart over and over? How do you tell a kid that he just has to find a way to pick himself up and put himself back together without letting his heart grow calloused? She let out a sigh. Well, here goes nothing. Toshi, that kid is far more scared of you than you are of him. Just talk to him. You're never going to know unless you try. She knew that wasn't what he wanted to hear. It's not what she would have wanted to hear, but it was true. Friends don't find people like us. We gotta find them ourselves. She had to hope that would be enough. Friday morning found Izuku dragging himself to the library, doing his best to cover his black eye with overgrown curls. Before he even properly walked in, the librarian was looking around with a worried expression. When her eyes locked with his, he dropped his gaze to the floor and tried to hurry past the computers. Before he could slip out of sight, he heard Shinso-san call out to him, "Kid, are you all right?" Dang it. He was far too polite to ignore her. Turning around, he plastered on his best fake smile and said, "Yes, Shinso-san, I'm all right." She did not look convinced. She looked him up and down and said confidently, "No, you're not. You're hurt." She cut herself off and stood up quickly, sending her seat spinning a little ways behind her. "Is that a black eye? What happened?" He took several steps back as she approached him far too quickly for his liking. She seemed to notice her mistake because she stopped, still a few meters away. She knew he was hurt before she saw his eye. She looked concerned even before she saw him at all. Was that a quirk? Could she sense pain? Could she not control it? Oh, Kami. He should leave if he's hurting her. Should he leave if he's hurting her? Kid, calm down. It's okay. I'm not mad. No one's going to hurt you, she said as she crouched down in an effort to look as non-threatening as possible. I, I'm fine. How did you know that before I even walked in? He asked. She dropped her gaze to the ground for a moment before she met his eyes again with an apologetic look on her face. Sorry, it's my quirk. I can't turn it off. I can sense emotions. That was the explanation she gave strangers. She always left out the second bit. She knew she had to bare her whole self to make true friends, but that didn't mean she had to go around letting every stranger she met reject her. But for Toshi, she added, and control them if I choose to. She had felt many people's responses to that sentence before. She had felt anger, betrayal, curiosity, disgust, and confusion, but never awe. It was so vivid, she could almost see it, and suddenly the kid she had never heard say more than a 10-word sentence was firing questions at her faster than she could hear them. You can control them? That's so interesting. How could you tell I was hurt? What pain isn't an emotion? What's the range of your control? Can you see emotions, or is it like a whole new sense? Can you calm people down from a panic attack? That would be so helpful in heroics. Can you track people's locations with it? Do physical objects interfere with it? How can you tell where emotions are coming from? Like, can you tell who's feeling what in a crowd? That must be really overwhelming. Do you He cut himself off abruptly when he finally registered her shocked expression. I'm so sorry, Shinso-san, he said as he bowed his head towards the floor. Kohaku could feel the moment the kid's amazement turned to fear and shame. Both emotions were so strong and so desperate that it all nearly gave her whiplash. She didn't even know how to respond. She was in shock. It wasn't until she felt the boy's shame turn into full-blown self-hatred that she snapped herself out of it. No, hey, no, kid, it's okay. I was just surprised. I'm not mad at you, honest. She tried to reassure, but she could feel that he didn't believe her. Somewhere amid all the theatrics, Hitoshi had come over to see what was going on, and from behind Izuku she could see him looking at the two of them with confusion. She tried to wave him away because it felt like this kid was on the edge of a crisis, but he stayed put. Little brat. She turned her focus back to the kid. I'm going to be honest, but I can feel what you're feeling, so just calm down, take a breath. It's okay. I'm not mad at you. Oh no. He was hurting her. Like flicking a light switch, she felt the boy's swirling emotions turn off. I, I'm sorry, Shinso-san. Don't worry about it or me. It's fine, he said with another bow before he turned on his heel and left for the computers, giving Hitoshi a small nod on his way. What the heck was that? Hitoshi said once he was sure Greenie was well out of earshot. When did you walk in? She asked in return. During whatever he was ranting about. I didn't know he could talk that fast. Neither did I, she replied, trying to collect her thoughts enough to answer the question as he walked closer. I don't know. He just felt off, and he was limping a bit when I saw he had a black eye. And he asked me about my quirks, so I told him, and, well, you heard the rest. You told him about your quirk? All of it? Yeah. Hitoshi stared at her in shock for a moment. What did he say? I'm not entirely sure. He had a lot of questions. That's when you walked in. I hardly caught a word of it. He was so excited. I've never felt someone get excited about my quirk. I think he thought I was mad at him. He got so scared. She felt a tiny spark of hope rise in Hitoshi's chest before he snuffed it out. You still think I should talk to him today? He asked. She thought of all the swirling emotions the boy was feeling and how he was able to push them all down in the blink of an eye. It was concerning, to say the least. She was inclined to let the boy get a handle on his emotions and leave him be, but she was officially worried about this kid now. She finally settled on a compromise. Maybe just ask his name. Introduce yourself. Give him a minute first. Eventually, Hitoshi made it back to his usual computer. Greenie wasn't mumbling like he usually did when he passed. It looked like he was reading about first aid, which was concerning in conjunction with the black eye. He sat down in his spot and shot glances at the kid every few minutes. It was nearing the time when Greenie normally left when he finally plucked up the courage to say something. Shinso Hitoshi. That's my name. He groaned internally. Real smooth. Great job, Hitoshi. You really nailed that one. Oh, hi, Shinso, Greenie replied. Midori Izuku. Hitoshi couldn't help but giggle, but he stopped when he realized that was probably rude. Sorry, I've been calling you Greenie, and I guess I wasn't far off. Midoriya let out a little laugh. Hitoshi couldn't tell if it was fake or not before they both fell back into silence. When Midoriya got up to leave at his usual time, Hitoshi waved him off and actually got a shy wave in return.